And with thousands of our forces still stationed overseas, many military families are watching the ramped-up rhetoric from North Korea very closely.
It's something that all Arizona families should be talking about right now, because more military leaders say if we go to war, it is highly likely we'd have to bring back the draft. Nicole Kreitz has the story you will only see on 3TV.
Greetings from the President of the United States. Your friends and neighbors have selected you to represent them in the armed forces of the United States.
Jeff Mellinger was 19 when he got a letter.
The return address was the White House, Washington, D.C., and that was before zip codes.
That changed his life.
You are hereby ordered to report for induction no later than 0700 hours, 18 April 1972.
He left his job laying drywall to join Army Jump School. And instead of doing his time and getting out as fast as he could, he re-enlisted and joined the elite Army Rangers. He served nearly 40 years, rising in the ranks to retire as Command Sergeant Major in charge of Allied forces in Iraq.
I loved it, and I miss it every day. My knees and back may not, but I do.
He survived 27 roadside bombs in 34 months in Iraq and retired 6 years ago, the last enlisted draftee in continuous active duty.
39 years, 8 months, and 13 days.
So will he truly be the last?
Since the draft ended, is now the first time with what's happening in North Korea that you've considered it might be time to bring that back?
If something seriously happened on the Korean Peninsula, end of the day, you can only fly so many airplanes and launch missiles, and then what do you got to do? Somebody's still got to put their boots on the ground. Can the all-volunteer force do it? And stay in Iraq and Afghanistan and Syria and the 32 other countries around the world that were doing humanitarian missions or whatever.
He said he'd support reinstating the draft if our military needs it, and that's not all.
You also seem pretty adamant that if we bring back the draft, it can't be just men 18 and over.
I think if you have a draft to do anything other than draft men and women, you are speaking with a forked tongue.
He served with the first female four-star general and says times have changed.
With the exception of the people who are serving now, America doesn't have any skin in any of the games we're playing.
With a skyrocketing budget for benefits and reenlistment bonuses and less than 1% of Americans serving in our all-volunteer military, Mellinger says a draft might eliminate a lot of public apathy. He says while current events often seem as if the worst to come is unfolding before us, history is the best perspective.
The draft is not a new thing. There were riots in this country over the draft during the Korean War. You could buy your way out in the Civil War. You could pay for one of your employees to take your place.
Mellinger says the way we fight wars today would get around a lot of the old exemptions.
And even people with physical problems can sit behind a keyboard these days, so maybe those deferments would change.
Considering the course his life took, how that draft letter he didn't ask for molded him into the leader he became, he says it's all about embracing your unseen potential.
This country is full of residents and some citizens, and the difference is citizens give back, residents just take.
Whatever unfolds, he hopes it will spark a conversation for people to be more involved, intentional, and appreciative.
You know, whatever it is, everybody ought to do something, because that gives you an appreciation for the things you have and the things you benefit from.
Nicole Kreitz, 3TV.
Certainly something to talk about. And in our history, there have been 4 drafts, all of them in the 20th century. It started with World War I, when 2.8 million Americans were called to service. The largest draft, let's see, of course, was in World War II, when 10 million Americans were drafted. And then in Korea, you have about 1.5 million Americans drafted. And of course, the Vietnam War, when 8 million Americans were drafted. Right now, there are 1.4 million active troops here in the U.S.
And so war is what the world got after the formation of the Federal Reserve there in America just before Christmas in 1913. And within 6 months we saw the outworking of this plan to bringing in the New World Order with the assassination of the Archduke Ferdinand there in Sarajevo in June of 1914, which was the event which started off World War I. And this was all according to a plan that was laid out in the previous century by a man called Albert Pike with the help of 3 other leading Freemasons. Albert Pike was born in 1809 in Boston, studied at Harvard, then later served as Brigadier General in the Confederate Army. After the Civil War he was found guilty of treason and jailed. He was pardoned by fellow Freemason President Andrew Johnson in 1866, with whom he met at the White House the very next day. The only monument to a Confederate general in Washington, D.C. was erected in Pike's honour. Pike was one of the founding fathers and head of the ancient accepted Scottish rite of Freemasonry, being the Grand Commander of North American Freemasonry from 1859 to 1891. In 1869 he was the top leader of the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan, and in 1871 wrote the Masonic Handbook, The Morals and Dogma of the Ancient Accepted Rite of Freemasonry. And so Albert Pike's greatest claim to fame would be that as a 33rd degree leading Freemason in America there in Charlottesville, South Carolina, he set up the Palladian Rite with the help of a Jesuit by the name of John Peter de Smet Mazzini in Rome in Italy, where Mussolini came out of from a lodge there in Italy at the time of the Second World War, and likewise Otto von Bismarck, the leader of the Prussian Parliament and also a man who was most responsible for setting up the Second Reich in Germany, the First Reich being the Holy Roman Empire and the Third Reich being Adolf Hitler, who came up out of that lodge in Germany, and also Lord Henry Palmerston, who was a Knight of the Order of the Garter and the leading Freemason in England at the time, was also part of this Palladian Rite. And so he was the Prime Minister of England at the time of the Opium Wars in China, and also was Queen Victoria's Foreign Secretary. And so these are the men that set up this Palladian Rite that took over all the Western lodges from that time on. And we know, for example, that Albert Pike wrote a letter to Giuseppe Mazzini in August of 1871, and this is what he said about 3 world wars. The First World War must be brought about in order to permit the Illuminati to overthrow the power of the Tsars in Russia, and of making that country a fortress of atheistic communism. The divergences caused by the agentur, that is the agents of the Illuminati, between the British and Germanic empires would be used to foment this war. At the end of the war, communism will be built and used in order to destroy the other governments and in order to weaken the religions. And so here we see the outworking of the First World War was in fact the overtaking of the Tsar of Russia, and he was deposed and executed, and communism was established, and Russia became a fortress of atheistic communism. And this was financed by the bankers there in Wall Street. For example, we know that Jacob Schiff boasted on his deathbed that he gave $20 million in gold to the Russian Revolution. And so the Jews from Wall Street were financing the Jews in Russia, who were the Red Army, fighting the White Army, the native white people. And so the Federal Reserve created a Great Depression in the 1930s, which was the very opposite to the thing that it was supposed to do, which was to create economic stability. And so let's turn our attention now back to the plan of the international bankers, which is described in this letter between Albert Pike and Giuseppe Mazzini. The Second World War must be fomented by taking advantage of the differences between the fascists and the political Zionists. This war must be brought about so that Nazism is destroyed, and so that political Zionism be strong enough to institute a sovereign state of Israel in Palestine. And of course in 1948 Israel declared independence after they had bombed the King David Hotel. During the Second World War, international communism must be strong enough in order to balance Christendom, which would then be restrained and held in check until the time that we would need it for the final social cataclysm. And after the Second World War, of course, communism was made strong enough, and also we know the weaker governments were being taken over. And in 1945, at the Potsdam Conference between Truman, Churchill and Stalin, a large portion of Europe was simply handed over to Russia. And on the other side of the world, the aftermath of the war with Japan helped to sweep the tide of communism into China. So let's return now to the letter written by Albert Pike to Giuseppe Mazzini. The Third World War must be fomented by taking advantage of the differences caused by the agentur of the Illuminati between the political Zionists and the leaders of the Islamic world. The war must be conducted in such a way that Islam and political Zionism mutually destroy each other. Meanwhile, the other nations, once more divided on this issue, will be constrained to fight to the point of complete physical, moral, spiritual and economic exhaustion. We shall unleash the nihilists and the atheists, and we shall provoke a formidable social cataclysm which in all its horror will show clearly to the nations the effect of absolute atheism, that is, the origin of savagery and of the most bloody turmoil. Then everywhere the citizens, obliged to defend themselves against a world minority of revolutionaries, will exterminate those destroyers of civilization, and the multitude, disillusioned with Christianity, whose deistic spirits will from that moment on be without compass or direction, anxious for an ideal but without knowing where to render its adoration, will receive the true light through the universal manifestation of the pure doctrine of Lucifer, brought finally out into the public view. This manifestation will result from the general reactionary movement which will follow the destruction of Christianity and atheism, both conquered and exterminated at the same time. And so let's have a look now at a speech given by a rabbi back in 1952 there in Budapest in Hungary. And this was to all the rabbis talking about World War III. We're going to begin by looking at this book called Pawns in the Game by William Guy Carr. And in this book it points out the speech that was given by Rabbi Emanuel Rabinovich way back in 1952 in Budapest, Hungary, to a meeting of the Emergency Council of Rabbis. And so let's have a look at this speech now that was given. Greetings, my children. You have been called here to recapitulate the principal steps of our new program. As you know, we had hoped to have 20 years between wars to consolidate the great gains which we made from World War II. But our increasing numbers in certain vital areas is arousing opposition to us, and we must now work within every means at our disposal to precipitate World War III within 5 years. And of course, the Korean War happened 5 years after the end of World War II, and also the takeover of China and the Communist Revolution. And so this is the beginning of World War III. A goal which we have striven so concertedly for 3,000 years is at last within our reach, and because its fulfillment is so apparent, it behooves us to increase our efforts and our caution tenfold. I can safely promise you that before 10 years have passed, our race will take its rightful place in the world, with every Jew a king and every Gentile a slave. Applause from the gathering. You remember the success of our propaganda campaign during the 1930s, which aroused anti-American passions in Germany. At the same time we were arousing anti-German passions in America, a campaign which culminated in the Second World War. A similar propaganda campaign is now being waged intensively throughout the world. A war fever is being worked up in Russia by an incessant anti-American barrage, while a nationwide anti-communist scare is sweeping America. This campaign is forcing all of the smaller nations to choose between the partnership of Russia or an alliance with the United States, and of course this represents the Cold War years, doesn't it? Our most pressing problem at the moment is to inflame the lagging militaristic spirit of the Americans. The failure of the Universal Military Training Act was a great setback to our plans, but we are assured that a suitable measure will be rushed through Congress immediately after the 1952 elections. The Russians, as well as the Asiatic peoples, are well under control and offer no objections to war, but we must wait to secure the Americans. This we hope to do with the issue of anti-Semitism, which works so well on United Americans against Germany. We're counting heavily on reports of anti-Semitic outrages in Russia to help whip up indignation in the United States and produce a front of solidarity against the Soviet power. Simultaneously, to demonstrate to Americans the reality of anti-Semitism, we will advance through news sources large sums of money to outspokenly anti-Semitic elements in America to increase their effectiveness, and we shall stage anti-Semitic outbreaks in several of their largest cities. This will serve the double purpose of exposing reactionary movements in America, which can be silenced, and of welding the United States into a devoted anti-Russian unit. Within 5 years, this program will achieve its objective, the Third World War, which will surpass in destruction all previous contests. Israel, of course, will remain neutral, and when both sides are devastated and exhausted, we will arbitrate, sending a control commission into all wrecked countries. This war will end for all time a struggle against Gentiles. We will openly reveal our identity to the races of Africa and Asia. I can state with assurance that the last generation of white children is now being born. Our control commissions will, in the interests of peace and wiping out interracial tensions, forbid the whites to mate with whites. The white woman must cohabit with members of the dark races and white men with black women. Thus the white race will disappear, for mixing the dark with the white means the end of the white man, and our most dangerous enemy will only become a memory. We shall embark upon an era of 10,000 years of peace and plenty, the Pax Judaica, and our race will rule undisputed over the world. Our superior intelligence will easily enable us to retain mastery over a world of dark peoples. Question from the gathering. Rabbi Rabinovich, what about various religions after the Third World War? Rabinovich, there will be no more religions. Not only will the existence of a priest class remain a constant danger to our rule, but belief in an afterlife would give spiritual strength to irreconcilable elements in many countries and enable them to resist us. We will, however, retain the rituals and customs of Judaism as a mark of our hereditary ruling caste, strengthening our racial laws so that no Jew will be allowed to marry outside our race, nor will any stranger be accepted by us. We may have to repeat the grim days of World War II when we were forced to let the Hitlerite bandits sacrifice some of our people in order that we may have adequate documentation and witnesses to legally justify our trial and execution of the leaders of America and Russia as war criminals after we have dictated the peace. I'm sure you will need little preparation for such a duty, for sacrifice has always been a watchword of our people, and the death of a few thousand Jews in exchange for world leadership is indeed a small price to pay. To convince yourself of the certainty of that leadership, let me point out to you how we have turned all of the inventions of the white man into weapons against him. His printing presses and radios are the mouthpieces of our desires, and his heavy industry manufactures the instruments which he sends out to arm Asia and Africa against him. Our interests in Washington are greatly extending the Point 4 program for developing industry in backward areas of the world, so that after the industrial plants and cities of Europe and America are destroyed by atomic warfare, the whites can offer no resistance against the large masses of the dark races, who will maintain an unchallenged technological superiority. And so, with the vision of world victory before you, go back to your countries and intensify your good work until that approaching day when Israel will reveal herself in all her glorious destiny as the light of the world. Illuminati means holder of the light.
Hours before, in the suburbs of New York City, an evil and sadistic man brutally stabbed Jewish Americans at a rabbi's home during their Hanukkah services. Everyone here today stands in unwavering solidarity with our Jewish brothers and sisters. And together, all of us, we're going to eradicate the sinister scourge of anti-Semitism. And we will protect Jewish communities and all members of the Jewish faith from the wicked forces of hatred and violence. And you know that, and the love by evangelicals, Christians, for Jewish people and for Israel is incredible. It's incredible. We will not rest until the horrible and vile ideology of anti-Semitism has been defeated and destroyed. For this reason, I recently signed an executive order to restrict federal funding to any college or university that spreads, supports, or promotes anti-Semitic prejudice in any form.
Mr. Jones owned a cotton plantation and many slaves. One day he was talking to the owner of the plantation next to his, and Mr. Jones was lamenting the fact that times were tough. He was having to work his slaves harder than ever, and was having trouble with some of them being disobedient or trying to run away. The other plantation owner said he knew someone who could help.
Day 1.
One day, Mr. Jones called his slaves together so a man named Mr. Smith could talk to them. Before beginning, Mr. Smith whispered to Mr. Jones, "Whatever I say, do not contradict me or interfere, and I promise you your slave troubles will end." "My name is Mr. Smith," he said to the slaves, "and this may be the happiest day of your lives. From today forward, you will no longer be slaves, but free men." Mr. Jones was so shocked he started to step forward, but Mr. Smith gestured for him to remain silent. He did, only because the other plantation owner had spoken so highly of Mr. Smith's skills. "You are no longer the property of Mr. Jones," Mr. Smith continued. "You are free. No more will you be forced to labor for the benefit of Mr. Jones. Now you can work for yourselves." Now the slaves were all murmuring and looking at each other. Many were smiling, many were looking puzzled. "In fact, you are now free to leave the plantation whenever you want," Mr. Smith said. "However, since we are surrounded by other plantations, if you leave, some other plantation owner will likely claim you as his own the moment you set foot on his property. So I urge you not to risk your newfound freedom by doing something so foolish. Instead, I suggest that you stay here, no longer as slaves, but as willing participants and part owners of this plantation. Yes, this is now your plantation." Mr. Jones bit his tongue to keep from objecting. "For now, we might as well leave Mr. Jones in charge," said Mr. Smith, "since he's the only one with any experience at running a plantation, which is quite a complicated thing to manage. But he will no longer be your master, but just another worker on the plantation. In fact, he will now be using his organizational and management skills to serve you. Whatever problems you may have had with him before, you are now all equals, and you need each other to make this work. If we all cooperate and work together, we can all reap the benefits together. In honor of this happy occasion, I present you this new symbol of togetherness and cooperation, this flag, which shall be the emblem of the new free Jones plantation." He held up the new flag, but most of those listening were still too amazed to respond. "And this shall be our motto," Mr. Smith announced. "We work together as free men for our mutual benefit, pledging our allegiance to the Jones plantation, which stands for prosperity, liberty, and justice for all. To celebrate, everyone has the rest of the day off. Enjoy your freedom, do as you please, and be back here tomorrow morning, bright and early, so that we may begin work on this great and noble new endeavor as equal free men." Finally convinced that Mr. Smith was serious, the former slaves applauded and cheered.
Day 2.
"We all want this plantation to do well," Mr. Smith said at the beginning of the next meeting, "so we can all share in the benefits. We all know that it takes a lot of effort to make a cotton plantation work. Just because you're all free doesn't mean you can stop working. In fact, since you're now working for yourselves, I expect you to work even harder than ever before, but now with pride and joy, knowing that you're working for yourselves. Of course, there still have to be rules. If everyone just does whatever he wants, the plantation won't produce anything. This experiment will fail and we'll all starve. You should be thankful that Mr. Jones has agreed to stay on to lend his knowledge and skills to this endeavor, and I trust you will all do your own part to make this work. Several of you have been chosen to act as project supervisors to manage different aspects of the operation, to make sure everyone is doing his assigned job, to make sure that the rules are followed, and so on. The rest of you may head out in the fields to start your first day of work as free men."
Day 3.
The next morning, Mr. Smith had a grim expression on his face as the daily meeting began. "I have an unpleasant duty to do today," he said. "Yesterday, Charles was caught keeping some of the cotton he picked, presumably to sell for his own personal profit. That is against the rules. That is stealing. For that, Charles must be punished." Two men tied Charles to the whipping post. "I take no joy in this," Mr. Smith continued, "but you must understand, if we do not maintain order, if we do not have rules that we all abide by, then the plantation will fail, and we will all suffer." The whip cracked against Charles' back. "But if we all pitch in for the common good, then we can all prosper. Being free doesn't mean you should be selfish and greedy. We must each do our assigned duties and obey the rules, and then we can all benefit, and each of you will receive your appropriate share of the profits." A young man named Samuel stepped forward. "But if you and Mr. Jones decide the rules and whip us if we disobey, how is that any different from what we had before?" "How can you say that?" Mr. Smith asked. "I'm shocked. You were a slave before, and now you're free. Things still need to be managed and organized by those best qualified to do so. Do you know how to run a plantation, Samuel?" "Well, no," he answered. "But if we're free, why do we get no say in what the rules are and how things work?" "I'm surprised at your ingratitude," Mr. Smith answered. "None of you know how a plantation is run, so you're in no position to be making decisions about how things are done here. You don't seem to appreciate all the things that Mr. Jones provides for you, from protecting you from all the outside threats that you know nothing about, those who would come here, capture and enslave you, if not for Mr. Jones' protection, to making sure that you all have food and housing, tools to work with, you're cared for when sick and injured, and so on. There wouldn't be a plantation at all, no cotton to pick, no land to plant and harvest, if not for him. You should be grateful that he's made possible the level of comfort you now have. Your lives would be far worse if not for him. Nevertheless, as free and equal participants in this endeavor, from now on at each meeting, any worker may have 2 minutes to ask questions or voice suggestions or complaints." With that, the workers all seemed satisfied and headed out again to the fields to pick the cotton.
Day 4.
I have a big announcement, Mr. Smith said as the daily meeting began. Mr. Jones' cousin is here, and not just to visit and see how our project is coming along. It has been decided that from now on, you will be deciding who will manage the plantation. Of course, this job can't be done by just anyone, but every 3 months we will have a special meeting at which all the workers will vote on whether we think Mr. Jones should run the plantation or whether we think his cousin, Mr. Johnson, should run the plantation. That means that ultimately you are in charge because you will be deciding which man you want running things on your behalf. If you don't like the way things are being managed, you now have the power to change it. Amazed and pleased, the workers headed out again to the fields to pick the cotton. Days passed, months passed, a year passed, and the plantation continued to operate as before. Sometimes Mr. Jones was in charge, sometimes Mr. Johnson was in charge, but the day-to-day routine stayed exactly the same. The workers worked hard, long hours every day, and still had little to show for it. Every day the meeting would begin with them all reciting the Jones Plantation motto, "We work together as free men for our mutual benefit, pledging our allegiance to the Jones Plantation, which stands for prosperity, liberty, and justice for all." One day Mr. Smith announced, "Samuel is asked to say a few words this morning, and whatever the rest of us may think of his ideas and opinions, we are all free here, and that means we are all allowed to speak our minds. So, Samuel, you have 2 minutes. Begin." Samuel stepped forward, looking scared. "I was excited when all this started," he began, glancing nervously at Mr. Smith and Mr. Jones. "But don't you all see what's happened here? Nothing's changed. We're all still slaves." There were grumbles of disagreement from the crowd. "They tell us what to do and whip us if we don't. They still make all the rules and punish us if we disobey. They let us make suggestions and complain about things, but they never really change anything. They let us choose between Mr. Jones and Mr. Johnson, but what's the difference? The situation stays the same. We do all the work and they take as much as they want and decide how much they'll let us keep. They live in luxury, made rich by the cotton we pick. We do all the work and have to build our own huts, grow our own food, and take care of ourselves. They leave us just enough that we don't revolt or run away. This is not freedom. We're all still slaves. They've only changed the words they use, but nothing else has changed. They say we're all free and equal, but we're not. They command and we obey. That's not freedom. That's not equality. They say we're free to leave, but all that means is that we're free to be someone else's slave. Why should we work or obey the rules? We didn't agree to this. They made the system. They forced it on us. They control and rob us and call it freedom. They've deceived you into thinking that being able to choose which slave master you'll work for is the same as being free. It's not. Open your eyes. If you keep what you produce, they call it stealing. When they take what you produce, they call it sharing and fair distribution. Can't you see that this is all your time? Ease up, Samuel, Mr. Smith announced calmly. At his gesture, 2 supervisors grabbed Samuel by the arms and led him to the whipping post. "I'm sorry, Samuel, but you've broken the rules. There are rules against encouraging others not to work and encouraging others to break the rules. You're only hurting all of us with your discontentment and your complaining and your disobedience." The whip fell and Samuel let out a grunt. "Without rules, without order, all would be lost. Without law, there would be chaos. We can't just behave as wild animals, each doing whatever he pleases. We must all follow the plan and all do our duty for the betterment of everyone. And those who do not must be punished." The whip fell again and blood flowed freely from Samuel's back. "Samuel, it is you who are stealing from the others. When you don't do your assigned work, you are making more work for others. When you disobey the rules, it is you who are endangering the future of everyone else here. You are the thief. You are the criminal. You are the one trying to destroy the arrangement that keeps us all safe and prosperous." At every lash of the whip, the other workers cheered louder and louder, some yelling curses at Samuel. "Being spoiled and selfish, you complain about everything, talking as if you're oppressed. But you are the one ruining things. You are the one keeping us from being all we could be. It is your greed and your rebelliousness that is hurting all of us. They all play by the rules," Mr. Smith said, gesturing at the others. "What makes you think that you don't have to? You think you're above the law?" There were loud yells of agreement as the whip fell again. "We must maintain order," Mr. Smith proclaimed. "To make this plantation great, to make it so that we can all be happy and prosperous, to have the society we want, there have to be rules. We all have to contribute our fair share to this great endeavor, and we cannot tolerate actions and attitudes that seek to undermine the amazing things that together as free men we have achieved and will continue to achieve." Mr. Jones was smiling as he gave Mr. Smith a pat on the back. The crowd was cheering so loudly that none of them had noticed that Samuel had died.